Hello and thank you for watching the Angry Rooster Creations channel. Today we've got another fountain pen related video. I am looking at 4 inks from the Diamine Forever inks line. Originally I'd planned to try to get samples of all of the inks in this line, but some of the places I was looking to get the inks from, they kind of went out of stock, so getting all of the colors was not really going to be possible for me. I believe there's 15 colors in total. And so I ended up trying to find some of the colors that I potentially might look at getting myself, of the colors available. Predominantly, I've been looking for a permanent purple ink for a while, so this Passion Flower was a guaranteed sample I wanted to try out. I also picked up the Solar Yellow because I do not yet have any permanent light fast yellows. I actually don't have any yellow fountain pen inks. Haven't even used any yellow fountain pen inks at this point in time. I picked up this dark Amazonia green because even though I do have one shade of green, I picked up a shade of green that is darker, and then also this hyper green, which is a lighter shade of green than the green ink that I currently have. That's a permanent ink. Now, before I get too far into this, I predominantly use my inks and my fountain pens for drawing and artwork. So I have a preference towards inks that are waterproof, but most importantly, light fast. These inks here are pigmented inks. They are made to be permanent inks. They're what they call a micropigmented ink, or nanopigmented, excuse me, I believe is the terminology they use. It has a very fine pigmented powder. And so these are, as the name suggests, with a Forever name, they're supposed to be water resistant or waterproof and light fast or fade resistant. So in this video, I'm going to test it on 4 papers. 3 of those are going to be art papers, the kinds of papers that I typically use for drawing and artwork. And then the first paper we're going to be drawing on here, as you can see, is a piece of 20-pound copy paper. That's sort of going to be a control. I'm going to go ahead and ink up my pens for this video. Now, 3 of the pens I have here are going to be the same. They're going to be these Jinhao 619 777 Lamy Safari clones with extra fine nibs. The 4th pen is going to be this 992. Also has this Jinhao 992 that also has an extra fine nib. The main reason I'm using a different pen here is things that have happened in the past have rendered one of these pens completely inoperable, and another one has an ink in it that I didn't want to empty out for these reviews. So, but they are all Jinhao extra fines that, generally speaking, write approximately the same between the 2 pen styles. So I'm going to do a quick cut and fill these pens, and then we'll get on to the writing test. Alright, and now we're going to do our writing test on our 20-pound copy paper. Alright, so that concludes the writing test on the 20-pound copy paper. Now I will say, for some odd reason, I did have the purple ink want to hard start. I haven't really had issues with this pen as far as hard starting and not wanting to write. If anything, I would have expected maybe have that problem out of this particular pen, because I've had that in that past, but I believe that was down to that specific ink that I was trying in this pen at one point, because I put that in another pen and had the same issue. So it might be this purple in particular compared to the others, which I didn't have any problem with, especially not that Amazonia. It seems like it could be a little not as free-flowing. Now, as far as the ink colors themselves, or how they handled on the paper, for the most part, I don't really see any feathering or anything like that. Nothing where the ink acted odd on the page, at least not from this front side, which, you know, being as how this is indeed copy paper. Maybe on the Amazonia a little bit, I see some feathering down here at the end. That being said, copy paper is not the kind of paper you would generally use with this ink. What I am very impressed with is this solar yellow. Against the white paper, it is very legible. Now, as an ink for art, I would use this as an accent color, and it would be an accent color around other colors, potentially even black ink, so it would stand out more than just having the yellow ink itself alone on the paper. But as it sits, I'm very happy with the color of that yellow. From what I see on this paper, that's actually pretty nice. The hyper green is not quite as bright as I was expecting it to be. It is a little bit more subdued. I would almost call this more of a grass green than, say, a neon green. And back to that purple, hopefully is right with the next papers, because it did start flowing better. It seemed a little lighter than I was expecting. I actually expected that to be darker than what it is. And all of these seem to have a dry time on the copy paper. Most of them start smearing. The purple started smearing at 3 seconds. The Amazonia looks like it goes back to 5 seconds. Hyper green looks like it smeared at 5 seconds, or 6 seconds, excuse me. And the solar yellow smears starting at maybe 5 seconds. Usually most inks that I've tested on copy paper dry almost instantly because it is a very absorbent paper. So I suspect on the art papers, and when I get to them, this is going to be quite a longer dry time than some other fountain pen inks. Now, as far as bleed through and ghosting, this is actually surprising. That Amazonia green is the only one that really shows through. Now, that being said, I didn't have a scratch sheet back here. I don't think it would have bled. It don't look like there's some pretty heavy ghosting with the Amazonia green. I don't see anything that would have bled through to the page on the back side if there was another page. The others didn't really bleed through, but they're pretty light colored. Now, that being said, these inks are not necessarily inks that you would use on a paper like this, but if you had some kind of document that was printed on copy paper that you needed to keep around for records purposes, and you need to sign something on that, needed it to stay in place, you might be using an ink like this on copy paper. But I think in most instances, the primary purposes that these inks serve, copy paper is not what you would be using. But if you had to use it, they seem to work pretty good on this paper. So our next paper is going to be the 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper. And this here is 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper. Alright, that concludes the writing sample on the Blick 50-pound white sulfite drawing paper. Now, once again, I did actually have a hard start on that passion flower. I did sort of put more pressure on the nib to try to promote some flow as I was writing with it. So it does look darker on this paper. Of course, that also could be a difference in the paper from the copy paper. I'm just going to bring that over real quick and kind of compare. I think it's mostly the same, just slightly darker. Of the art papers I'm going to be showing you, this is the cheapest, lowest quality of the art papers and the least ink friendly. And it tends to be the most absorbent. But once again, I don't really see any kind of feathering at all, actually. Not even on that Amazonia, which did feather a little bit on the copy paper. Now, here there is some shading. There is some shading. I wasn't sure if this ink was going to shade, or these inks were going to shade or not, but you can see, of course, like I said, I had to put a little bit of pressure there, but even on the Amazonia here, you can see some shading in the E and F, T and H here. I don't know how well if that's going to show up on camera, but there is some visible shading. Not as much in the hyper green, and the solar yellow, it's just yellow. It's just a bright yellow, and you can see that on the camera. I can look in the little screen here and see that yellow for yellow ink, it's really standing out on the page from what yellow inks I have used, not in fountain pens, but in other things. But from writing samples I've seen of other yellow fountain pen inks, this really does stand out on the page. Honestly, so far, I'm most impressed with that Solar Yellow, and I really like to look at the Amazonia. The tone seems about the same between this and the copy paper on all the inks. As far as the back, there's really no ghosting or bleed through whatsoever on the back. I mean, you can kind of tell in a couple places that something was written on the back here. That right there is where I was pressing hard trying to get that passion purple or passion flower to hard start. So I was really pressing, trying to get some ink out of the pen. Like I said, it was hard starting. That might be the pen itself, but I haven't had that issue with this pen before. So, yeah, they work just fine on this paper. Like I said, this is not necessarily the best paper for ink work, but they work perfectly fine on this paper. And so far, like I said, I'm very happy with that yellow. Our next paper is going to be a Koh-i-Noor 50-pound sketch paper. And here is the Koh-i-Noor 50-pound sketch paper. And that's going to do it for the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. Now this time I did actually not really have a hard start with the passion flower, which was good. So let's see. Tone seems about consistent with the other papers. Now this paper is even less absorbent than that Blick paper. So as I sort of expected, I think I can see, I don't know how if this is going to show on the camera, that Amazonia looks pretty dark, but you can see, I think you can see in the passion flower on the camera, there is definitely more shading. If it doesn't show up on the camera, you just may have to take my word that the Amazonia is shading quite a bit, especially in those ENFs, the dot in the top of the T there, and width on the cursive writing. The H down there, the 619, that 6 has quite a bit of shading. I don't know if that's going to show up. The hyper green, I mean, there might be some slight shading, but it's hard to tell. And the solar yellow is just yellow. You can't really see shading, but it does stand out on the page, and you can definitely read that solar yellow. And it is a bright yellow. It's not like a yellowy orange. It's a yellow yellow. Now, as far as the dry time, all of these, it's kind of hard to see on some of them because this paper does have a toothy texture to it, and some of these are pretty light. But I think, obviously, the Amazonia was still wet at 10 seconds. The passion flower did actually smear at 10 seconds. It was just a little bit on the dry side on the writing there. The hyper green looked like it smeared down to at least 7 seconds. And the hyper yellow, it's hard to tell, but I think it smeared at all 10 seconds. It's just that smear is hard to see. And you can see the scrubby smears. These inks do take a little bit longer to dry. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention the dry times on the Blick 50-pound paper. On most of them, it was about the same as what we're seeing on this. So the dry time looks the same on these two papers. 10, 10, 6, and most likely 10 or 8. Like 8 at the least. So, now I do usually see most of the ink start to smear on this paper here that I've tested because this is not the most absorbent paper. Now this is a 50-pound paper. It is a thin 50-pound paper, about parchment weight, but there was no bleed throughs on these. These do not seem to be bleed or feather prone inks. And I would say that's partially due to them being pigmented inks. But all in all, So far, I am very impressed with what I'm seeing. I'm really impressed with that solar yellow. I am really impressed with the Amazonia. I do like the passion flower. The hyper green is not as bright as I would think, but to be completely honest, most of the time permanent inks and pigmented inks generally are not very bright and vibrant, which is one of the reasons why this solar yellow is so surprising to me. I would not expect a permanent, let alone a pigment ink, to be that vibrant. So with that said, we're going to move on to our very last paper, which is a 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. And so for our final writing test here, we have the Canson 98-pound mixed media paper. Alright, that concludes our final writing test. So, once again, this paper, of all the papers that I have done, this mixed media paper is the least absorbent paper. This paper is meant to sort of handle a little bit of everything, including some watercolors. You can't really saturate the paper with water or it'll kind of buckle, but it does handle watercolors quite well. So it's not an extremely absorbent paper. As such, I believe this has probably got the most, I know you can see it on the purple there, it's got the most shading that we've seen so far. Once again, the hyper green there, as far as shading goes, it's got a little bit in the yellow. Like, yeah, there's no shading in the yellow. So those bottom two, there's not really much in the way of shading. The hyper green and the passion flower definitely have shading. Like I said, because of the darkness of the way the Amazonia, excuse me, is showing up on camera, you may not see some of that shading. I don't know. I think you can. That E and that F on both those E and Fs, you can definitely see it. But on I know it's coming through on the camera for the purple. Now, as far as dry time, it looks like the purple was dry at 9 seconds. The Amazonia was still wet after 10 seconds. Looks like the hyper green was dry after either 8 or 9 seconds. And the solar yellow, I can tell that the 9-second smeared some. Not so much about the 10-second. So about 9-10 seconds is what it looks like to dry on this paper. And you can see, obviously, all the scrubs did smear to a certain degree. No feathering or anything, and like I said, except for that little bit of feathering that happened on the Amazonia green on the copy paper, these lines are pretty much what they should be for the nib that they're being written with. It's all very consistent in those terms. Now, obviously, there's not going to be any kind of bleed through or show through. This 98-pound paper is about as thick as cardstock, and it is less absorbent than cardstock. So you wouldn't expect bleed through to show up on cardstock or ghosting, and it definitely won't do it on this, especially considering what this paper is made for. So overall, on all the papers I've tested them on, I think it seems to handle pretty well on pretty much everything. Now, before we move on to the water resistance test, which will be the last one, I am going to show I did do some chromatographies of these inks, but just be prepared for it to not be very eventful. Now, unlike some of the previous chromatographies where I have done the chromatographies on paper towel, this time around I actually did have some white coffee filters. So this is done on coffee filter paper. These were dipped on, I did put down a line of ink with a dip pen, and then put the paper here in a mix of water and 70% isopropyl alcohol at a roughly 1/3 mix, 1 part alcohol to 2 parts water. And as you can see, most of these have a pretty permanent line down at the bottom. The only two where you can't really tell the permanent line is the hyper green and the solar yellow, and that's mostly just due to them being very light colors. You can't really, as well, you can still kind of see this is the hyper yellow, or excuse me, the hyper green. This is solar yellow here. Now you can see there's not really much in the way of any kind of shade. It's just a solid color that just gets lighter as it goes up the paper. That's just the pigment traveling up the paper. There's not, I would assume, looking at the chromatography, that the component of this ink is a single color pigment. It's not like a mix of colors. And this tends to be what I've seen from other people that's done chromatographies on pigmented inks. Tends to be how they are. And not really just pigmented inks. Most of the time, if you have a permanent ink, an ink that's labeled as being a permanent ink, water fast, but more importantly, I think light fast inks, usually this is what you see in the chromatography. It's just one color that gets slightly lighter as it goes up the filter paper. There's not much in the way of, you know, having a lot of different component parts to these types of inks. It's just a binder, a color pigment, and then water that thins the ink out. That's pretty much, from my understanding. There might be a little bit more to it, but basically that's what a pigment ink is. A pigment, a binder, and a diluting agent, which, like I said, for fountain pens, is water. Alright, and our next test is going to be the quick water test. Alright, and now for our quick water test. For the water test, this is a piece of 20-pound copy paper. I am going to take my pen, I'm going to write the name of the ink, and then I'm going to draw a little grid square. I'm going to time it for 30 seconds, and I'm going to take this little pipette, I'm going to drip some water on it, wait another 10 seconds, rub the water in, see if I can get anything to move, and then blot it off with a paper towel to see if any ink lifts. I'm going to go ahead and do it for all 4 inks, and then we'll break it down and talk about it. Alright, so that's going to do us for the water test. Now, I am going to say this, although the ink did not seem to really move on the paper. I don't know if this is going to show up well, but I did get a little bit, mostly in that Amazonia green, a little bit on the hyper green, but all of them, I did actually lift a little bit of pigment on all of them. It's very faint. I could kind of see it in the water when I was rubbing it in, mostly on the green, yellow here. I didn't see it on the purple, but there is a slight purple to this. Like I said, I don't know if it's going to show up on my blotting paper. Not a lot, barely perceptible, but mostly on the Amazonia green you can see it, but that's the darkest of the 4 colors I'm testing. But when you look at it on the page, it doesn't really look like it moved that much. Maybe a little bit here on the Amazonia, if I can get this. It looks like maybe there was a smear. But also, I would like to say that in all of the tests on all the papers, the green Amazonia green here had the longest dry time. So if one of these was going to smear due to water, that's the one I would expect. Looks like possibly we got a little bit of a smear there. I could have potentially even smeared, like that one, I'm not sure. No, it looks like there is a little bit of a bleed there. So, I mean, all in total, very, very, very water resistant. And this was only 30 seconds after writing, so I wouldn't say this is a definitive as far as a waterproofness test. If you let these inks set for longer, I believe you'd probably have better results. I think Brian Goulet did a video where, or the Goulet Pens did a video where they tested these inks and they submerged them and had pretty good results. I can't remember what their dry time was, but at least within 30 seconds, though, that's pretty good water resistance. And really, those inks didn't start to move until I was rubbing the water in. If you just had water drip on and you dabbed it off with something absorbent, I don't think you would see any kind of movement really, unless you start rubbing it in like I did. But all in all, these are highly water resistant. So I wouldn't worry too much about water hitting a piece that has these on it and worry about things moving around. Now, with all that having been said, what are my kind of final thoughts on these inks? So far, I am impressed with what I've seen. The flow issues with the purple, like I said, I don't know that I haven't had issues with this pen flowing in the past. It might be I could have possibly did something to it when I disassembled it to clean it for the last ink that I had in it. These aren't the best pens in the world. I've done a video on those pens. But they do work for the purpose that I got them for, which was using them as cheap pens to test inks. Now, with that being said, as far as cheap pens, that is one thing I would recommend. Because these are pigmented inks, the flow issues with that might actually be because of the ink, because this is a pigmented ink. Could be that pen. I'll see. I got more pigmented inks I'm going to be testing in future videos, but it might actually be an issue with the ink. Some pens do not like pigmented inks. That's just part of the, comes with the territory. The other thing though is I would suggest not putting inks like this in valuable pens. So for instance, I put the Hyper Green in this pen. I tried to clean that off. I don't know if you can see, but the section, and it's going to show up, already does appear to be stained here. There is a greater potential to have staining and things happen with these inks, but most importantly, when you're using any pigmented ink, do not leave it in a pen for extended periods, especially if you are not consistently writing or using that pen, and do not use it or to keep it in a pen that has a dubious cap seal and that is prone to dryouts. If this stuff dries in your pen, and this is just general across the board with pigmented fountain pen inks, if a pigmented ink dries in your pen, you might not be able to fully clean out the feed, and it might ruin your pen. So most of the time when you hear people talk about pigmented inks, they will tell you not to use pigmented inks in valuable pens. And I can tell you with one of my Genhao 619s, like I said, originally I bought these to test inks. The orange one got ruined because I was testing some Diatramentis document inks, and I did not realize that these pens don't seal that well. The caps do not seal that well. And within less than a week, that pen dried out, and I tried to clean it, and it pretty much ruined the feed in that pen. That pen was dead. Of course, it's a $1.20 pen, not a big loss. Had I known that the seal was not that great in these with the caps on those pens, I would never have put that ink in that pen, but I didn't know, and I learned that lesson the hard way. So that's one thing I would caution, and like I said, not necessarily with these inks in particular, but anytime you're dealing with a fountain pen ink that's pigmented, take into consideration you probably don't want to put it in a valuable pen. Another thing too is, aside from staining issues that may or may not occur with an ink like this, like these, would be a reason why you, generally speaking, would not want to put this kind of ink in, say, a demonstrator pen. Another thing is, if you can look at these ink vials, because these are pigmented, these inks are very opaque. Okay, when you're looking at it, besides the fact that they're thin because they're fountain pen inks, it's almost like looking at a bottle of an acrylic paint. These would not be aesthetically pleasing in a demonstrator pen anyways. Or like, some kind of a piston fill pen or something with like a clear acrylic barrel, because it'll just look like the pens have paint in them. And that's not necessarily just these inks. That, once again, is a thing about pigmented inks across the board. Like I said, primarily I'm looking at these particular inks for art purposes. And the biggest test that I want to see on these inks really is the light fastness test that I plan on doing with these. I'm going to take the papers that I have here, and what I'm going to do this a little different than the other two tests that I've done. When I am done with my papers here that I have, I'm actually going to take a paper cutter and cut these papers in half. One half of the paper is going to get stuck in a window for a month in direct view of the sun. The other half of the paper is going to get stuck in a manila envelope and put up on my shelf away from sunlight. And then after a month, I'm going to take the papers out of the window, set them side by side, and do a comparison and see if the inks have faded. One, because I'll be able to check the inks that were, the ink as it was written at the same time on the same sheet of paper. We'll be able to see if the ink fades, but also if there's a tone shift in the paper from the light exposure, which could, change the hue of the ink on the page. So that is a test I will do in the future. And as far as whether or not I order full bottles of these inks is going to largely depend on the light fastness test. That's the big thing I want to see. Because for an art piece, if you're going to write or draw something and display it where it's going to be out in the open and it's going to be exposed to light, light fastness is very important. And there's most of the inks that are light fast are pigmented inks. There are some exceptions to that. Some of the Noodler cellulose reactive inks, which I have quite a few of, and I have showcased those on this channel. But frankly, so far I've found if you're looking for a permanent light fast ink, whether it's some of those cellulose reactive inks, which can react funny on certain papers, or you're looking at a pigmented ink, you're going to have to deal with quirks. Pigments being potential clogging, not keeping them in pens, flushing and cleaning the pens before storing, all that kind of stuff because of potential destruction of a pen if the ink dries in your pen. And then the cellulose reactive inks, they can be finicky on certain papers. It's always going to be a trade-off. So, just generally speaking, if you're looking for a permanent fountain pen ink, you're going to have to deal with some quirks. So far, as far as writing and writing on papers, these seem to be working great on every paper I tested. Now, I didn't test the composition notebook in this video that I've used in other videos because, frankly, for an ink like this, you're going to, generally speaking, pay more for these types of permanent inks. You're going to have to deal with more maintenance for these pigmented inks. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to use an ink like this that has more maintenance and upkeep and a higher cost to go and write on a paper that is not as permanent and resilient to the effects of time as the ink itself. Generally speaking, if you're going to write with an ink like this or draw with ink like this, at a minimum you want an acid-free paper. And not all acid-free papers are the same, but you want a paper that's not going to yellow, that's not going to age, that's not going to get brittle and crinkly and potentially fall apart. Because if you're writing with something like this, you want that writing to last, you also want the paper to last. So writing in a cheap composition notebook is not really what you want to do. The copy paper is kind of in the same boat, but copy paper is a pretty good control because generally speaking, if an ink writes well on copy paper, it'll write well on most anything. There's exceptions to that rule, and also sometimes you have to sign an important document that you might have to store and it just gets printed out on 20-pound copy paper, so that's what it is. And if that's something where you need a permanent signature, you might be looking at an ink like this to write on a piece of copy paper. But generally speaking, important legal documents will not be written in composition notebooks. So I omitted that paper for this test. With all that having been said, if you watched this far in the video, I thank you very much for watching. If you got any information out of this video, if you thought it was informative, I'd appreciate a thumbs up down there. If you have any questions about the way I did my test, papers I used, etc., or you have any comments or suggestions, drop them down there in the comment section. I usually try to read all of my comments. At this point, I don't get a whole lot, so if you comment, I should see it. And if you have some criticisms or critiques about anything that I've said or any way that I conducted in my test, also throw that down there. All feedback is good. All feedback is important to help me make better videos and do better tests. and present things better. So, you know, if there's something that can be critiqued, by all means, throw it down there too. And if you've seen this video and some of my other videos, if you liked what you've seen, if you got something informative out of it, you want to see more, then I'd also appreciate a subscription. That would also help me out. But with having all that been said, that's going to do it for this video. I thank you for watching, and I hope to catch you on the next one. Bye.